Hi, this is Paul. A number of months ago, I wanted to do a series of 4 videos. I just got the conversation video out, didn't get any further, and that one's sort of the marquee video. I'm thinking about replacing that one too on my channel. But another one I wanted to do was talk about evangelism and what it means given everything else that I've been talking about and thinking about over the last 3 years. Now, I think in many ways the atheist-Christian dichotomy, which is usually sort of the framework for conversation with a lot of Christian attempts at evangelistic conversation, isn't giving it, it's providing diminishing returns. It doesn't mean it's no longer productive or fruitful in many contexts, but in other contexts it isn't. And so I'm always thinking about how to have better conversations where I can present my ideas more clearly and have them be better understood. Now, I was watching the newest Rationality Rules video the other day. And again, when I watch a lot of these videos, I just think we have to get beyond debating about the super thing in the sky. I think a lot of Christians understand Christianity and theism that way. It's certainly true that the atheists think in those terms. And so then the debate boils down to, is there or isn't there a super thing in the sky that responds to your prayers and values your tithes and offerings and sacrifices? That's sort of where this thing boils down to. And then, well, whether or not your religious activities work. And again, religious is completely contextualized in a secular framework. It is reduced to religion S. And that's usually where the debate goes. And I think it's a horrible place to start the conversation. It's a pretty severe reduction of Christianity that lends itself to these facile approaches to the faith. The Christian God is not a thing in the world. And I've talked about that in one way or another. My God number one, God number two, my conversations with Brett Sockold. When you actually happen upon many Christians understand this and sometimes you'll see it in a debate that no, this super thing in the sky is not really what Christians are talking about. But then Christians sort of struggle to find words to describe it. Ground of all being. And so that's really where things sort of boil down to. In terms of conversation partners, I see individuals like Tom Holland and Rafe Kelly leaving secular modernity, but not quite knowing towards what. And both would say they've got real questions about the resurrection, the way the Bible and history square off. And again, a lot of modern apologetics has been just about that, this sort of correspondence notion of here's this description in the Bible and can we find some physical evidence for that? And again, I'm not saying that that is unimportant, but I don't know if we actually know quite how it is important and why it is important, and so a better way to talk about it. I think a lot of the, and depending on how long this video goes, a lot of what the Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke video boils down to is the functionality of religious relationalism, not rationalism, relationalism. John is working on a religion that's not a religion. Both John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson try to build from the ground up. Okay? I think both are more relationally skilled and actually practice relationality better than their particular schemes can afford. I think Peterson is, once I get into the scheme I'm about to propose in here, Peterson is more eyes straight forward than up and down. A little hint of the schema. Vervaeke's more down, but both of them continue to work on this project of trying to get to the kinds of interpersonal relationality that we know we need from the bottom up. And I think the longer this avenue is pursued, the more evident the poverty of whether it's non-reductive physicalism, which is John's word, Peterson's Darwinian truth. I think the more bankrupt those approaches are going to be. Part of the reason those approaches continue to be in style is because the hegemony of a scientific approach to knowledge has not receded sufficiently. But I think the rise of the IDW and the panic within the IDW as modernists realizing that this loss of rationalistic bottom-up knowledge is losing its grip on the culture and on society, well, they have real points. John Vervaeke, less in that camp, always one who's sort of been more open to some ideas that many in the IDW would just find too woeful. But yet, John continues to work from his non-reductive physicalism on up. And so my conversations, if you haven't seen my conversations with John and J.P. Marceau, we've pretty much focused on that. And J.P. Marceau has been just a wonderful conversation partner. J.P. got a degree in philosophy, and he's been studying John's work carefully. He contributes regularly to the Symbolic World, and he makes really a nice bridge partner as the three of us talk about that. We're working on a third conversation where we're going to talk about the problem of evil, which is a significant problem for Christianity. And so one that, in a sense, I've been able to sort of be on the offensive in some of the past conversations. Now, this isn't Philo-Nicaea so much, but there is an element of that, and I think a healthy element of it, if the Philosophia outweighs the Philo-Nicaea. Now, one of the things I really liked about the Peterson-Peugeot conversation was the focus on attention. And Jonathan, I think, is right, and I thought led Peterson well in terms of noticing that in many ways, for us at least, attention creates our world. And that's cogent psychologically in many respects, and it's certainly cogent religiously, because attention very quickly maps on worship. And I think part of the reason that conversation was so popular and so productive was because of this focus on attention. Now this is sort of the metaphor I'm going to throw out, and I'll see what y'all think of it in the comment section. Now, it's not just the comment section. Over the last couple of weeks, John Van Donk has been building the Estuary Support Network, which is a leadership training program for people who would like to lead their own estuary groups. If you're interested in that, let me know somehow, either in the comment section or shoot me a note on Twitter or something like that. And I think in the process of working this group for a year, what John Van Donk and I, there's too many Johns in this conversation. It's like the first century. What John Van Donk and I will probably be rolling out will be what I'm calling the Estuary Protocol, which will be a template by which almost anyone with some leadership skills, with some small group skills, should be able to start an estuary group and find it meaningful and productive and hopefully sustainable. So at some point, I'm going to bring some of the participants of John Van Donk's Estuary Leadership Support Network, and we'll do a video or some videos together. We'll both talk about the Estuary Protocol, and we'll model some of it. And I very much, ever since I sort of put forward the idea of estuary out there, people expected me to sort of bring it out and roll it out. But with a lot of what I do, I'm doing it. I really see what I'm doing in this space as really as sort of open source cognition. And so I throw out these ideas, and then I listen to all of you chatter. I listen on the Discord server. I listen on some of the other YouTube channels that are going around. I listen in the estuary groups, and I listen for the ideas and the memes and the metaphors that stick. And so I'm always thinking about how can we have better conversations that welcome atheists and non-believers and Christians and get us into the same space and have conversations that communicate well. Because, I mean, good communication is sort of the table stakes. It's not our goal, but if you don't have that, you're not going to get far in anything. So what I'm going to put forward today is an idea of living eyes up versus living eyes down. And as I use it, I hope it will come to mean something. Many of us, I think, especially Christians and what in the secular society we call religious people, live eyes up. In other words, we look up into the heavens, we look to God, and we work our way down from there. I think in the scientific realm, many people live eyes down. Now, well, let me roll this out a little bit. Now, I don't want the living eyes up or the living eyes down to devolve into a which one is better debate, because I think that can very quickly get as pointless as the debate over the super thing in the sky. All of us live both ways. In many ways, it's a question of priority. So living eyes up, you begin with your eyes up into the heavens. You start with emanation. That's one of the ways to talk about the ongoing Vervaeke-Pajot conversation is Vervaeke is very much emergence from the bottom. For example, personhood is an emergent property for Vervaeke. For Pajot and myself and many Christians, personhood comes from above. It's an emanation. We receive personhood from person, which is God. God is love. Love is relational. Love is personal. So very much the difference there. But so if you're living eyes up, or if you're walking eyes up, you start there with the relational and personal, and you sort of work your way down. Now, whether you're beginning with eyes up or eyes down, you're going to have to eventually get to the other place. And that's when we're going to talk about the reconciliation of heaven and earth, but we're not there yet. So living eyes up, you begin living eyes up, you start with emanation, you continue to deduce or obey down. And so in many ways, living eyes up is deductive. You start with this principle and then down you go. Communities do this with theology. And theological conversations in communities, debates about interpretation of Scripture, religious hierarchies, all of this is all beginning eyes up and working your way down. Now, at some point, it needs to touch down. It needs to touch down in community and as individuals. Everyone who is living eyes up sort of feels their way, stubs their toe in the world, and so we'll always have to look down. And there's going to be some middle ranges here too, okay? But living eyes up, you sort of begin with up and you work your way down. That's contrasted, of course, with living eyes down, where you begin with what's in front of you. You begin with earth, and eventually your eyes will reach to the heavens. Living eyes up, you begin with the heavens, and eventually your eyes come down to the earth. You slowly scan forward, because as you're walking, you realize if you're looking just in front of you, you won't know where you're going. And so I think living eyes down, you're often sort of in a herd, in community, following along with that herd, following along in that community. It's very susceptible to non-player character as tribes and herds, because you're beginning with earth. And you're probably doing better in terms of not stubbing your toe. You might be doing better in terms of following your particular landed footfalls, but the weakness of living eyes down is basically orientation and navigation, whereas the weakness of living lives up are stub toes, stumbles, short-term blockages and obstructions. And so I'm filling out this metaphor here. So if you're living eyes down first, you scan forward. It's more inductive. It's more emergent. It's from below. You're going to have to scale up a community, and probably you're nested in a community because that's how we human beings are born. We're not hatched. We're already born into a community. So you have that first draft that's imprinted on you. And it's probably going to be rather pragmatic. But at some point, heaven and earth come together. And living eyes up and living eyes down usually meet somewhere in the middle. And you can find a great deal of commonality in the middle. And there's lots of potential mappings with this. Eyes up is sort of rationalism. Eyes down is sort of empiricism. Eyes up is more perhaps Platonic. Eyes down is more Aristotelian. Eyes up is more special revelation. Eyes down is more general revelation. You can map it onto the Peterson-Vervaeke conversation. Eyes up is, again, emanation. Eyes down is emergent. And Peterson was talking, about insight, conscience, many of these sort of eyes up first modes, which are have long been mapped religious, and then the eyes down first, which tend to be pragmatic, communal, scientific, philosophical. And the goal is that these things meet somewhere and meet in a way that's coherent and cohesive. It's really, again, the reunion of heaven and earth. Now, there are a lot of middle realms in this, and I like this picture. This is Arches National Park in Utah, where I took a family vacation a few years ago. There's a lot of middle realms, and especially in our culture, our middle realms really do come up from the bottom. Philosophies, science, ideologies, politics. These are all sort of middle realms, and the inhabitants of those middle realms, you can often see religious eyes up and eyes down people sort of meet in the middle. And you find this religiously, for example, in the United States, where you'll have general tendencies, but you will find people from the different approaches sort of meeting in the middle for common agendas and to pursue common goals. Now, I think most societies throughout most of human history have lived eyes up first. And the evidence for that is all of the temples, all of the religion. This has been sort of the dominant way. Now, again, eyes up does not exclude seeing the ground in front of you. Eyes down does not exclude seeing up above you. But part of what happened in the 19th and 20th century was the sort of the emergence of eyes down. Now, this is a piece in the Hedgehog Review. I'll link to it below. Some of you won't like it at all. It's got its own religious and political biases, but he makes a good point about social capital, so I wanted to read some of it. There was a time in American history until 1900 when religious capital, acquired through religious socialization, training, and manifested in religious knowledge and piety, was actually the dominant species of cultural capital. Most of the nation's oldest and most prestigious universities were originally religious institutions. Many of the nation's best and brightest became pastors and theologians. Most of the books, magazines, and pamphlets published in the United States were religious in nature. Many were even written by clergymen. Denominational hierarchies corresponded closely to social hierarchies. To be received into the Episcopal Church was to have arrived. WASP piety defined legitimate taste. All this began to change in the late 19th century. More and more secular universities devoted to scientific research were established. Christianity and the classics were pushed to the margins of the curriculum to make way for humanistic and scientific subjects. Would-be clergy made way for aspiring managers and engineers. Divinity schools were quite literally moved from the center of campus to the periphery. Bohemian enclaves of secular intellectuals and educated professionals began to emerge in New York and everywhere. Expertise gradually replaced character as the goal of education and the criterion for leadership. In short, a new form of secular cultural capital was in the ascendant. The gradual devaluation of religious capital took the form of several interrelated processes. One was the rise of liberal Protestantism. By successively embracing evolution, science, and technology, and technocracy, and embedding them in a postmillennial view of social progress and reform, liberal Protestant theologians effectively enriched their old religious capital with a new secular capital. And if you go back to my conversations with Andrew Root in his 3 books, The Congregation in a Secular Age, Faith Formation in a Secular Age, and The Pastor in a Secular Age. In one of my videos a while ago, I read a significant amount of what I thought was a terrific narrative of what this article, in fact, was just describing. You can also see a lot of it in the work of George Marsden. I don't think any scholar has documented, any historical scholar has documented and focused on this to the degree that George Marsden has. And I mentioned this book in a recent video, The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, the 1950s and the Crisis of Liberal Belief. He also wrote, let's see if I have it here. He also wrote a good book on the process by which American higher education institutions, Harvard, Yale, the Ivy League, stopped being religious institutions and adopted this process that this article is talking about. But as the religious historian David Hollinger sagely observed, liberal Protestantism would prove to be a commodious halfway house on the road to secular progressivism. And by the 1970s, many liberal Protestants had reached the end of the journey and taken the off-ramp. And this is an article that, oops, let me get it back up on the screen. Oh, so I haven't been showing you what I've been reading. Sorry about that. How the Civil Rights Movement converted white liberal Protestants to secularism, basically making the same point. Evangelicals, however, produced their own form of cultural capital, and during the middle decades of the 20th century, fundamentalists and evangelicals built a subculture that paralleled and even began to rival that of the mainstream. And, this, of course, began in the 80s and has been, in many ways, the epicenter of the culture war. They had their own colleges and universities. They had their own publishing houses and media outlets. They had their own tchotchkes and musicians. The largest evangelical ministries were, in fact, sprawling business empires with multi-million-dollar market valuations. In this way, evangelical capital could be used to generate economic capital. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the new religious capitalism was that it functioned not through forced expropriation, but through voluntary self-expropriation. Please dial now. The new evangelical capital could be exchanged for political capital. Jerry Falwell has shown the way, but it was Ralph Reed's Christian Coalition and Pat Robertson's 1988 presidential campaign that really blazed the trail. Where Falwell had sought political access in order to promote policies, Reed and Robertson sought political power for its own sake. Meanwhile, as the number of educated evangelicals in the halls of power in business, media, and government increased. Now, see, part of the difficulty is when I read that in 2021, people imagine that evangelicals were displacing secularists. That's not true. Evangelicals were displacing mainliners. Now remember, when I keep referring to Chuck Colson's book, Born Again, an incident that I paraphrase in the book when he says, "Honey, I've become a Christian. I become born again." And she's like, "I thought we were Episcopalian." That's the transition that happened from after the counterculture and the civil rights movement, which sort of hollowed out the old mainline churches. When I talk mainline, Methodist, certain Methodists, certain Baptists, certain Presbyterians, Episcopalians. I mean, those held massive numbers of Americans, especially during the first phases of the Cold War from 1946, let's say, to 1975. when in 1975 you have a president who was born again that hits the cover of Time magazine. You have Chuck Colson. And then in the 70s and then the 80s, with the rise of the moral majority, you have this new ascendant wing. The value of a college from Wheaton College, the evangelical Harvard, did not yet equal that of a degree from secular Harvard, nor does it now. And it doesn't look like it's going to. The steady devaluation of religious capital and the infusion of economic and political capital brought about a gradual shift in the locus of religious authority. Now, this in many ways is a shift from living eyes up versus living eyes down. And again, evangelicals tend to start up and move down. Increasingly, secularists tend to start down and move up. The shift can be readily seen in the history of Grahams and Falwells. Both family patriarchs were theologically trained and denominationally ordained clergy whose reputations were largely based on preaching and publishing. And this is where I get into something I haven't talked about for a while, but platforms. And, Beth Moore, Baptists want to have a fight about whether women can be clergy, when Beth Moore is already one of the most influential persons in the Southern Baptist Convention, which she has now left. Well, where is her influence? It's not in the platform of the church. It's on other platforms, and that's exactly the process that this article is pointing to. Both families' patriarchs were theologically trained and denominationally ordained clergy whose reputations were based largely on preaching and publishing. In this, they represented the evangelical revivalists of the 19th century, such as Charles Grandison Finney and Dwight L. Moody, or, for that matter, liberal clergy such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Horace Bushnell. Not so their sons. Franklin Graham is a mediocre homilist whose official title is CEO of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Falwell Jr., meanwhile, is not even ordained. He often describes himself as a real estate developer, and of course now he's not even a college president. The shift becomes clearer when we turn to Paula White or Eric Metaxas. White's formal education ended in high school. Metaxas graduated from Yale, but with a degree in English. Their authority is not based on an official position within denominational organizations or formal training in Christian theology, nor is it based on religious capital in any meaningful sense. Rather, it derives from business success, media savvy, political connections, and a personal brand. And the personal brand is really what's key. Their influence is the culmination of a broader trend in which religious authority increasingly draws from non-religious sources: money, celebrity, access. And then he gets into the social field versus the religious field. So I'll link to the article, and if you're interested in it, you can find it. I think what we're seeing in this little corner of the internet is the transition sort of coming to the end of that style of religious hegemony, but the realization that a culture can only live with its eyes predominantly down for so long. And I think part of Tom Holland's contribution and Jordan Peterson's contribution to a degree in this area is helping people see that for a long time we've just sort of kept Christian eschatology, we've sort of kept Christian goals, we've sort of kept Christian morality, but with eyes down. Well, let's say you're on a hike and you're trying to arrive at a mountain, you're going to have to keep looking up at the mountain to sort of know how to cross. You're going to have to keep looking down so you don't stub your toe, walk into a bush, or walk into a river. Okay? So you're going to have to do both. You can only live so many generations looking down. And that's where everyone in their life is always looking up and down, okay, as individuals. But now as groups, what tends to happen is that we sort of herd up and we move as a herd and we just follow the elephant in front of us. That's how the elephants and the riders are up there chattering away, making up stories, talking about what we're doing, but the elephants are sort of riding this. And for the most part, there have been Christian elephants, and the elephants have been able to look down, and you have one or two elephants that sort of look up and sort of lead the herd and lead the pack. Now, the meaning crisis, I think, is part of this, because in many ways, the meaning crisis is living eyes down for too long. And all it becomes is one footfall in front of another. The scientific image won't tell you what is good or what is right. You have that old fact-value distinction. And so I think what we see with someone like Peterson and Vervaeke is the attempt to start from the bottom and see how high we can get up. Now, both Peterson and Vervaeke, of course, also do a little bit of peeking on top and looking for alignment. Because again, the goal is to connect heaven and earth. And that, again, is a long Christian goal, the reconciliation of heaven and earth. And I think actually it's a far broader goal that a lot of what we would call religious behavior in the West tends towards, that connecting of heaven and earth. Now, along the way, we tend to do a lot of dead reckoning, which in terms of goal and morality and many of these things is sort of better or worse. It's sort of A/B testing. And so living in a house is better than not living in a house. Not being an alcoholic is better than being an alcoholic. So there's a lot going on here. Better or worse isn't pointless. In fact, as I think about it, we've done remarkably well with better or worse, and there's a lot of built-in better or worse. I have some thoughts about this that haven't yet been able to gel into a video, but hopefully some will come. And this is especially true on the individual level. But it's usually much more short-sighted. And when you get to big questions, like, I've got a lot of big questions about, for example, the change in the sexual ethic. Jordan Peterson talks about the pill. There's a lot of questions in there. And, well, it doesn't seem to hurt anything right now. But as individuals, there's a lot of things that don't tend to hurt right now. Doing a lot of sitting, eating a lot of junk food doesn't tend to hurt right now. Maybe smoking, but decades of it in one human life can have a devastating effect. Now, as a herd, as community, those time spans are greatly elongated. And the better or worse as individuals isn't disconnected for the better or worse as a herd, but those time scales and those challenges are far more difficult to ascertain. And we've bumped into these things with a lot of scientific disruptions. Again, you can go onto YouTube and just YouTube search DDT, and you'll find lots of fun videos of this dude in a pit helmet meeting with these aboriginals, and he's eating DDT and some porridge saying, look, it's harmless. And all of the aboriginals are sitting there looking very skeptical. And in the moment in the 1950s, the dude with the pit helmet seemed to be the smart one. Now in 2021, the aboriginals aren't looking so dumb. So there's a lot of these kinds of things. And so speed and pace and size, these things all sort of matter. So at some point, community, as a community, however, as better or worse averages out among individuals and gets ramped up into multiple generations and centuries, we don't know. And I know that there's a lot of, it's sort of become very quickly in our culture, the flip on regard for, let's say, the health or morality of same-sex relationships. Okay, and we can look at one individual or a group of individuals, say, well, this is better or this is worse. But we don't know the impact of 3 or 4 or 5 generations. And again, 4 generations is 100 years. That's not very long. We don't know the impact of 200 or 300 years of this type of thing. And when we look at a bunch of other things happening in society, part of what's interesting is how connected things are. For example, I was having a chat with a friend of mine who's a psychologist and does a lot of testing of individuals for autism. And I said, what's with this rise in autism? And, he could very quickly list off a whole bunch of things that impact it. But the way we live, which by virtue of consciousness is very binary, on off, is very short term, it's living eyes down, we don't tend to see these things. And so what we do kind of through science is we get into these middle realms and we start to study. And of course, when you look at, well, I'll get there in a minute. So there are knotty problems, better or worse is less helpful with, because society can't change courses quickly. Let's say 50 years from now, we decide that distributing birth control is actually a horrible thing to do. That's not going to be undone within a year or two. These changes take decades, even centuries, to sort of play themselves out, far longer than one human life. But we as human beings always live on two levels. We live on the individual level and we live on the communal level. And they're deeply intertwined. I was, again, talking to the same psychologist, and he was saying, he looks around at the millennials, or he says pretty much anyone under 50, people over 50 in his community, they won't lie on their timesheet, generally speaking. They have sort of this ethic built in, and often he looks at younger populations and he doesn't see it. Now, maybe they'll grow it, maybe they'll develop it, and I think it depends on community by community, but there was just a lot in that first draft that older people imbibed. We didn't have the internet. Life was very different in 1975 when I was 12 years old than it is in 2021. We don't know. We really don't know how this pays out. Now, there's a lot of living eyes down, trying to look up going on. Before I played with YouTube and discovered Jordan Peterson, I was reading Jonathan Haidt. And I read his second book first, which I thought was good, but I enjoyed it so much I wanted to find another one. And so I found his first book, and I frankly think it's his best book. And basically, after I found Jordan Peterson, I very much wanted those two to talk together, which they did have a conversation, and it was a good one. But the connection and the relationship between Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and many others sort of in this space is they're trying to connect heaven and earth. But they're starting from the bottom. And they're starting from the bottom for very real ways. They're coming out of the academy, which, as I noted, basically made that transition 75, 80 years ago. And now we're only about a century into that transition, and already we're seeing the need to look up more. And we're discovering that building from the ground up isn't so easy, and plucking some of the wisdom that came from the top down seems necessary. And so in many ways, a lot of these authors are sort of piecing things together from top and from bottom. Right now, the intersection of ancient living eyes up first is being looked at from the living eyes down academic community, because they're saying we need some better general orientation. If you're going to arrive at this destination that you imagine to be good, you're going to have to keep looking up to the mountain and keep orienting yourself with respect to that goal. Now, part of what we're seeing, I think, is as we're watching new atheism recede, and it recedes slowly, it'll take another decade or so, and Sam Harris won't be what he is today. It's sort of Khrushchev saying to Kennedy, "We'll bury you." Well, you look at the Lindy effect from Nassim Taleb, and old things endure. That's why they're old. And that's not always a surefire way of knowing what wins, but Nassim Taleb is an investor, and that's sort of where you place your bets. Place your bets on things that have endured, and not just 20, 30, 50, 70 years, but centuries and millennia. And again, part of Jordan Peterson's work was to say, well, We should look Darwinianly too, and so has Brett Weinstein. But, what I see this as sort of the end of the subtraction story, where the old saying was, well, we had all of this living eyes up, and then we thought, oh, that was dumb. We can't get anywhere that way. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So we started living eyes down, and we discovered we weren't stubbing our toes so much, and we weren't scraping our legs in the branches, and we were sort of, not falling into pits and falling into rivers, and that was all really good. And it is really good, because nobody wants to stub their toe, and nobody wants to scrape their legs, and nobody wants to fall into pits or fall into rivers. But what we see is that in some ways the herds lose their way, because in a lot of ways the herds were following very ancient paths, and more of the herd is like, oh, we don't have to follow this old stinking path. Let's cut our new one. Well, where is it going? When actually many who break from the herd, especially in the ancient world, don't live long. So modernity is receding and taking some valuable things with it. Figuring out what to keep and what to chuck is always sort of the name of the game, and it's pretty hard. Christian secularity itself will be a costly loss, and I think we're beginning to see that. And, talking to people in Canada and the UK, I think we're seeing that quicker there. I've got a book coming from an old professor of mine from Calvin, Dale Van Clay, who basically built his career on looking at the religious sources of the French Revolution. And I was chatting with Dale on a listserv, and I basically asked him a question that I had hypothesized here, which was, if France hadn't kicked out their Protestant churches, would they have had the French Revolution? And his answer was a guarded, you're on the right track. And he showed me sort of a guy who had made that thesis, and what Dale does in his book is sort of work that thesis over. Need to look up, need to pay attention, need to figure out, need to look back a long ways, need to read more history, need more orientation. And the subtraction story, I think, is doomed. And in many ways, my question for the church is, will it be of help? Now, as I said, I talked about estuary quite a bit about a year ago. And estuary is something that you have been crowdsourcing with me. It's not something that I sort of received from Revelation on the road to Damascus and I'm now dispensing to you. That would be a very living eyes up sort of thing. It's much more we're sort of feeling it out together. And I'm talking to people who have been living eyes down and people who've been living eyes up, and I'm trying to help them talk to each other. Because, as I've said many times, many secularists and atheists are more Christian than they'd like to admit. And many Christians are more secular and atheistic than they'd like to admit. And so we should talk together. And we should find ways of talking together that are productive. So people are going to need time to learn how to live eyes up. And some Christians are going to have to spend some time learning how to live eyes down. Because the goal is the reconciliation of heaven and earth. The goal is the connection of heaven and earth. And there will be painful adjustments. I think we're going to see over the centuries churches change. And when we say churches change, we see that from a certain point of view. But that change is much more like an evolutionary change, where certain kind of Christianity dies and other kinds of Christianity come to the fore. It's certainly some people change their mind. And we saw this in the movement from the mainline to the evangelical. But mainline churches have been dying. Some mainliners have gone evangelical. And I think we've probably seen the heyday of evangelicalism. And the question's going to be, what comes next? Now, again, the very old groups like the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic, they're going to stick around. They've got a lot of built-in anti-fragility. Protestant groups are only about 500 years old, we're sort of always on the cusp of change. Protestant groups are sort of the fragile ends that sort of the leaves on the tree in many ways. We live and we die. We live and we die. We bloom and we wither. In many ways, the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics are sort of trunks and branches. But that will be the process, and it's going to be a long process. Church people are going to have to own some of their bloody toes and, feel a little embarrassed about falling in pits. Although Christians who are living eyes up and not looking down enough tend to get used to that kind of thing. But it's going to be a long process. So I don't know if this metaphor works. I don't know if this video has been helpful. But again, I do feel that we're sort of piecing this thing together, you and I, in the various ways in the comment section on the Bridges of Meaning Discord, in the conversations, in the meetup groups, and in this little corner of the internet, talking to Vervaeke, talking to Peugeot, and talking to many of the others. And so let me know what you think.